Late November swept into Silverwood Hollow with sharp breath, carrying the scent of pine needles and wood smoke through the neighborhood. The wind rattled gutters and whispered along the uniform rows of pale, two-story homes, each one a mirror image of the next. Every lawn trimmed to regulation height, every wreath hung precisely in the center of every door. To most, it was peaceful, predictable, a sanctuary of structure. But not everyone found comfort in perfection. At the far edge of quiet cul-de-sac stood a home that broke the rhythm, a cozy, time-worn house shaded by towering evergreens. It belonged to Margaret Holloway, an 82-year-old widow who had lived there since long before Silverwood Hollow was carved into suburban grids. Margaret was the neighborhood's gentle soul. She waved to the mailman with mittened hands. She always had cookies cooling by the window, and when Halloween came, her porch glowed with lanterns she had hand-carved decades earlier with her late husband. But as the seasons changed, so did Margaret's body. Arthritis crept through her joints, making stairs feel like mountains. Her daughter, Rebecca, helped install a wooden ramp from the front porch to the driveway, a simple, safe, and necessary addition. It was built with care, stained to match the trim, and allowed Margaret to remain independent in the home she loved. It should have ended there, a quiet solution for a quiet problem. But in Silverwood Hollow, nothing escaped the scrutiny of the Homeowners Association, and especially not the watchful gaze of its head, Beatrice Crowley. Beatrice had sharp eyes, sharper opinions, and a long memory for noncompliance. To her, the ramp was not an accommodation. It was an affront. And so, beneath the brittle gray skies of late autumn, a conflict began to smolder, one that would test the resolve of an elderly woman, the power of a petty bureaucracy, and the quiet courage that often lives where no one expects to find it. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The morning was cold, the kind of cold that settled in your bones and made the house creak like it remembered warmer days. Margaret sat by the window, steam curling from her tea, watching frost inch its way along the edges of the glass. Then she heard it, the metal clatter of the mail slot. She wheeled herself slowly to the door, her movements careful, deliberate, and retrieved the day's letters. Nestled between a heating bill and a charity envelope was a stark, white notice bearing the silver crest of the Silverwood Hollow Homeowners Association. Her stomach dropped. Inside was a typed letter, cold and clinical. It stated that her property was now under review for a compliance violation. Specifically, the addition of a non-conforming exterior structure. The ramp. The letter warned of potential fines. Attendance at the next HOA meeting was mandatory. Margaret's hands trembled. She had spent her entire life following rules, raising a family, paying taxes, giving more than she ever asked for in return. And now, in the winter of her years, she was being summoned like a misbehaving child for installing something that allowed her to safely leave her own home. She picked up the phone. The receptionist at the HOA redirected her call to the compliance office. A woman answered, her voice crisp and pointed. "This is Beatrice," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Margaret introduced herself. "I received a letter about my wheelchair ramp. I'm hoping this is a misunderstanding." There was a pause. Yes, the ramp." Beatrice's tone hardened, like metal cooling in the air. "You should have submitted an architectural request before installation." Margaret explained softly. "It was built for safety. I can't do stairs anymore. My doctor recommended it." "I understand," Beatrice replied curtly, "but that doesn't exempt you from the design process. Silverwood Hollow has standards to maintain. Property value, symmetry, aesthetic cohesion." "I matched the trim color," Margaret said. "It blends in." Beatrice didn't flinch. "That may be, but it disrupts the uniform porch line. If every resident made exceptions, where would we be?" "I thought the law protected accessibility," Margaret began. Beatrice cut her off. "This isn't about the law. It's about order. We'll address it at the meeting." The line went dead. Margaret sat in silence, the letter crumpling slightly in her lap. Outside, the wind stirred dry leaves across the driveway. She looked down at the ramp, a symbol of dignity, independence, and now Apparently, a problem. Her jaw tightened. She would go to the meeting. And this time, she wouldn't be offering cookies or cocoa. She'd be fighting for her right to stay standing, on her own terms. Wednesday evening arrived wrapped in bitter cold. Frost rimmed the edges of street signs, and porch lights blinked into the early dark like watchful eyes. Margaret bundled herself into a thick shawl. Her daughter, Rebecca, stood by the door, one hand on the wheelchair, the other steady on her mother's shoulder. "You don't have to do this," Rebecca said gently. "I do," Margaret replied, "because if they win now, they'll think no one will ever push back." They drove the short distance to the Silverwood Hollow Community Hall, a brick building that looked more like a library than a battleground. Inside, chairs had been arranged in a half-moon around a long folding table where 5 HOA board members sat, faces unreadable. At the far end of the table sat Beatrice Crowley. Her hair was perfectly pinned, her lips a thin line. Her hands rested over a clipboard like she was ready to strike it like a gavel. Margaret and Rebecca wheeled to the front row. A few neighbors offered quiet nods, but most simply stared. Everyone had heard. Everyone was curious, but no one knew which way the wind would blow. Minutes passed. Budgets were read. Landscaping updates discussed. Then Beatrice cleared her throat. Next item on the agenda, compliance concern regarding a recent unapproved exterior structure at 317 Renfield Court. All eyes turned to Margaret. She raised her chin, voice clear and composed. "That structure is my ramp." She spoke plainly, no theatrics. Just the truth. She explained the medical necessity, her fear of falling, the independence the ramp gave her, and how she believed, how she had hoped, it was protected under the law. "I'm not trying to bend rules," she said quietly. "Just try to live with dignity." There was a long silence. Beatrice smiled, a rehearsed, tight-lipped expression. "We sympathize, Miss Holloway, but had the proper procedures been followed, perhaps we could have proposed a less obtrusive design, one that preserved the symmetry of our community's aesthetic." Rebecca's jaw tensed. "It's the same color as the house. It's flush with the porch. You're punishing her because it's a ramp." From the board, a voice interrupted. Marlon Patel, a younger board member with kind eyes. "Does it meet safety standards?" he asked. "Yes," Margaret said. "It was professionally installed." Another board member, Lydia James, added, "Under federal accessibility law, we cannot require removal of a necessary accommodation. It's protected. I don't see how a fine applies." Beatrice's smile faltered. Her pen tapped against the clipboard, sharp, rhythmic, irritated. The debate lasted 10 more minutes. Beatrice tried to pivot, suggesting repainting, redesign, even vegetation to soften the visual impact. But her influence was slipping. The board took no action. No fine. No removal. The ramp would stay. Meeting adjourned. Margaret exhaled slowly as neighbors filtered out, murmuring to one another. A few stopped to say thank you. Others just offered quiet glances, some embarrassed, some grateful. Outside, the wind had picked up, but Margaret felt a strange kind of warmth. She had faced the rules. And for once, the rules had bent to what was right. But across the street, from behind lace curtains, Beatrice watched. And she wasn't finished. December came with the first real snow of the season, thick, silent, and relentless. Overnight, Silverwood Hollow transformed. Driveways disappeared. Trees bowed under white blankets. And Margaret Holloway's ramp, so carefully constructed, sat vulnerable beneath it all. Margaret woke early, eyes drifting to the window as the world shimmered outside. But her thoughts weren't on the beauty. They were on the danger. A frozen ramp could mean disaster. She called Jacob, the teenage son of a neighbor who had offered to help. By mid-afternoon, he arrived with a shovel and a warm smile, carefully clearing the snow and salting the wood. Margaret thanked him with a hot cup of cider and a grateful smile. But they didn't notice the figure behind the curtain across the street, watching. Beatrice Crowley. To her, the snow was an opportunity. The ramp, bare and obvious against the pristine white, seemed in her mind even more offensive, even more out of place. Her defeat at the HOA meeting had been public, and though wrapped in courtesy, it had humiliated her. So she hatched a plan. If the ramp couldn't be removed by force, perhaps it could be rendered unusable. That night, as the neighborhood slept under a silent snowfall, Beatrice slipped outside, dressed in black, shovel in hand. She crossed the street with careful steps, her breath fogging in the icy air. She moved quickly. Shovelfuls of snow were heaped onto the ramp, more than had fallen naturally. A deliberate, calculated mound, heavy, packed, and meant to freeze. She paused only once, ducking behind a mailbox as a car rolled past. When she returned to her home, fingers numb and cheeks flushed, she allowed herself a small smile. By morning, Margaret would find a wall of ice where her path should be, and maybe then she'd reconsider staying. The next day, Margaret rolled to the door, frowning. The snow on the driveway had barely risen past ankle height, but her ramp was buried in a small mountain. It wasn't natural. The edges were too clean, the pile too dense. Rebecca arrived moments later, grocery bags in hand. Her face changed when she saw it. "Mom, this doesn't make sense." This wasn't just snowfall. They called Jacob, who came quickly, but even he paused at the sight. "It's like someone dumped a snowbank right here," he said, confused. "Not the driveway, just this." He worked in silence, shoveling and salting until the ramp was clear again. Margaret thanked him, but her heart felt heavy. She didn't have proof, but in her bones she knew. Someone wanted to make her feel unwelcome. Someone wanted to trap her. And Margaret Holloway had lived long enough to know, when people start barring your path, you either surrender or you build a better one. Word traveled fast in Silverwood Hollow. By the time the second storm rolled in, the story of the mysteriously snow-packed ramp had made its way into the booths of the local diner. Over fries and steaming mugs of cocoa, Jacob recounted a strange pileup to his friends, Maya, Liam, and Noah, a tight-knit group of high schoolers known more for their robotics club trophies and neighborhood gossip. "I swear," Jacob said, leaning in, "someone's trying to block Miss Holloway's ramp. It's always snowed in way worse than the rest of her yard." Maya raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess. Beatrice?" "Has to be," Liam replied. "She's had it out for that ramp since day one." Noah, quiet but always thinking, suddenly snapped his fingers. "You know those heated driveways some houses have? What if we made her ramp like that?" Jacob blinked. "You mean heated? Like it melts snow automatically?" "Exactly. They make roof de-icing cables. We could run them under the boards. Cheap ones, safe ones. It wouldn't take much. And if we wire it right, she flips a switch and boom, no more snow." They all paused. It was genius. What started as a casual conversation turned into blueprints on napkins. Maya started a group chat titled Operation Melt. Liam offered to pitch in his own allowance for materials. Jacob promised to talk to his dad's friend, a retired electrician named Mr. Alvarez, to help make sure the wiring was safe. Noah volunteered to handle the online research. Later that week, the group knocked on Margaret's door. She greeted them with her usual warmth. But the stress of recent weeks had worn on her. Her eyes looked tired, her shoulders slightly slouched. Yet when Jacob explained the idea, what they wanted to build, her expression shifted. "Hope, you do that for me?" she asked softly. "You've always done things for us, Miss Holloway," Maya said. "Cookies support a smile when we needed it. Now it's our turn." Margaret covered her mouth with one hand, tears rising. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Liam grinned. And she did. Over the following days, the plan picked up speed. The teens quietly launched a neighborhood fundraiser online. They titled it, "Heat the Path for Margaret." Within 72 hours, neighbors had donated more than enough. Some gave $5. Some gave $50. A few included notes. "For the cookies you gave my son when he scraped his knee. Because dignity should never need permission." Mr. Alvarez stopped by the house, studied the ramp, and gave a firm nod. "We can do this. Safely, effectively, and it won't even show." Margaret watched it all unfold, overwhelmed. What began as a small act of sabotage had blossomed into something far more powerful. A community refusing to be cold-hearted, and teenagers turning frustration into innovation. They weren't just building wires under wood. They were building resistance. And soon they'd be ready for whatever winter tried next. The installation took place on a cold Saturday morning, breath visible in the air, excitement thick as wool. Jacob, Maya, Liam, and Noah arrived early, bundled in layers, tools clanking in their backpacks. Mr. Alvarez met them at the Holloway home, toolbox in hand, eyes twinkling beneath his knit cap. Rebecca brought out thermoses of hot chocolate, while Margaret watched from her front window, her hands clasped together in quiet awe. Plank by plank, they lifted parts of the ramp surface, threading heat cables underneath like lifelines. Mr. Alvarez supervised every step, checking spacing, testing voltages, making sure the cables wouldn't overheat or short out. They ran the wires to a weatherproof switch box near the front door and connected the system to a GFCI-protected outlet under the porch. By mid-afternoon, the cables were live. The ramp, visibly unchanged, now held a hidden power. They tested the system. Slowly, the boards warmed to just above freezing, enough to melt snow on contact without causing damage to wood or wheels. "It's like armor," Liam said, brushing his fingers across the faintly warm surface. Silent, invisible armor. Margaret rolled onto the ramp and felt it, subtle, steady warmth under her wheels. Her eyes welled with tears. "This," she said softly, "is a miracle in timber." The teens chuckled, but behind their smiles was something deeper. Pride. Not for the praise, but for the purpose. That night, across the street, Beatrice Crowley noticed the faint glow of a new switch box near Margaret's door. She narrowed her eyes. Her suspicions, fueled by whispers and the surge of neighborhood goodwill, boiled into irritation. They were doubling down, making the ramp permanent, making her look foolish. The next snowfall arrived 2 nights later. Not a blizzard, but a steady, heavy flurry that blanketed Silverwood Hollow in silence and white. And Beatrice? She acted. Past midnight, she bundled up once again, took her shovel, and crept across the street. Her breath steamed in the air as she heaved scoop after scoop of snow onto the ramp, packing it deep, pressing it down. She imagined the panic in Margaret's eyes the next morning, the inconvenience, the defeat. But Beatrice didn't know what now lay beneath the wood, because by the time morning broke, the snow was already melting. Steam rose in delicate wisps from the ramp's surface. Water trickled down its sides like spring runoff. The driveway and sidewalk remained blanketed, but the ramp? Dry, clean, triumphant. Margaret stepped outside, rolled down the slope with ease, and saw the slush pooling at the bottom. Rebecca arrived moments later, her eyes wide with astonishment. "It worked." Margaret nodded, voice quiet but firm. "It worked." Across the street, behind her window, Beatrice watched. Her sabotage had vanished, melted, evaporated, and with it, her grip on control. The neighborhood noticed. They always did. As neighbors shoveled their driveways and hacked at ice-covered sidewalks, they glanced across the cul-de-sac and stared. Margaret's ramp shimmered with beads of water. Not a patch of snow clung to its boards. It was as if winter had simply skipped it. And soon word spread. "Did you see Miss Holloway's ramp? How is it clear already?" "I heard the teens installed some kind of heating system, like a driveway, but smarter." By noon, photos began circulating on the Silverwood Hollow Community app. One showed the ramp completely dry, while every surrounding path was buried. Another featured Jacob and Maya crouched beside it, tools in hand, faces flushed with pride. Posts poured in. "We need more of this kind of thinking in the neighborhood. This is what real community looks like. Forget uniformity, this is humanity." Beatrice read each comment, like a splinter sliding under her skin. No one mentioned her name. No one needed to. The subtext was clear. People knew, or at least suspected. The ramp had been targeted. And they also knew someone had tried to bury more than just snow. Worse, the HOA board, perhaps sensing a shift in public sentiment, stayed quiet. Beatrice sent emails. She raised concerns. "Are we even sure this installation meets electrical code? What if the runoff refreezes and causes someone to slip? But the board had done their homework. Mr. Alvarez had submitted paperwork. Margaret had permits. The ramp was compliant, inspected, and safe. Still, Beatrice couldn't let it go. She called for an emergency review. At the next HOA meeting, she stood once again before the board, this time with a thick binder and a stiffer tone. The ramp disrupts visual cohesion, she began. The heating system could create liability issues. What if the water drains into the sidewalk and someone falls? Or worse, it shorts out. Do we even know the long-term implications? Margaret sat quietly, Rebecca at her side, the teens behind them. No one interrupted. No one flinched. When Beatrice finished, the room was quiet. Then Marlon Patel cleared his throat. "The ramp is medically necessary," he said calmly. "The heating is safety equipment. If it were a heated driveway, no one would blink. The fact that it helps someone avoid injury, that's not a violation. That's progress." Lydia added, "The water drains into the yard, not the sidewalk. We've seen it. It's safer than most of the untreated paths in this neighborhood." Beatrice opened her mouth, closed it, opened again. But there was no more room for complaint. The board voted. Unanimous. The ramp would stay. Applause filled the room, polite, restrained, but real. Margaret bowed her head, hands folded in her lap, holding back emotion. Beatrice sat down, her face pale. She had lost again. But this time she knew it. The weeks that followed moved slowly through Silverwood Hollow. The snow continued to fall, though it now seemed gentler, less adversarial. For Margaret, mornings began with quiet gratitude. Each time she wheeled down the dry, gently steaming ramp, she felt the reassurance of safety beneath her. No more ice, no more danger, no more dread. Across the street, Beatrice Crowley watched it all unfold from behind lace curtains. The ramp had become more than just wood and wires. It was a symbol, not just of resistance, but of progress, of the neighborhood shifting, inch by inch, away from rigid rules and towards something softer, more human. And in the quiet corners of her house, Beatrice felt it: guilt, regret, unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to gnaw at the edges of her carefully built convictions. She still couldn't bring herself to say the words out loud, but she knew she had crossed a line, and no amount of bylaws or binders would justify what she had done. She had acted out of pride, out of fear, out of a desperate need to control what was never hers to dictate. Then came the day of the fall. It was early morning. The sun had not yet climbed high enough to melt the sheet of black ice that had crept across Beatrice's walkway. She stepped out to collect her newspaper, just one careless step, and her foot slid. Her body twisted, landed hard. A sharp jolt of pain surged through her knee. She lay there for several seconds, stunned and gasping, staring up at the sky as it snowed gently onto her face. Eventually, she managed to crawl inside. She bandaged her swelling knee. But something had changed. For the first time, she understood, viscerally, how fragile a body could be, how quickly independence could vanish with just one slip. 2 days later, leaning on a cane, Beatrice crossed the street. It took effort and humility. She stood at Margaret's porch, her breath visible in the air, heart thudding. Margaret answered the door, surprise flickering across her face when she saw her neighbor there, wounded, nervous, and without a clipboard. Beatrice hesitated, then spoke. "I slipped on my walkway, and I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're doing okay." Margaret studied her for a moment. Then, with quiet grace, she nodded. "I'm managing. The ramp makes things easier." There was a pause. Beatrice shifted on her feet. "Would it be all right if I came in for a moment?" And just like that, Margaret stepped aside. They sat in silence for several minutes, the warmth of the home soft against the chill that clung to Beatrice's coat. She didn't confess, not outright, but her presence said what her pride could not. Margaret didn't press her. She offered tea. Beatrice accepted. That afternoon, 2 women sat in the living room. One who had tried to bury a ramp in snow, and one who had built her life around forgiving the coldest of gestures. And for the first time, they spoke not as combatants, but as neighbors. Winter's grip loosened slowly, reluctantly. Silverwood Hollow began to emerge from its frozen slumber as the days lengthened and the soft hum of spring began to stir. The last major snowstorm came in early March, with heavy winds that rattled windows and piled snow into mounds against driveways and sidewalks. The world outside looked unchanged, still frozen in time. But something in the neighborhood had thawed. Margaret's ramp, its coils hidden beneath the surface, held its ground against the snow once again. It didn't struggle, didn't waver. It simply worked. The melting began as soon as the snow touched it, a quiet, resilient defiance of winter's fury. The rest of the neighborhood spent their days shoveling, salting, and scraping away at the relentless ice. But Margaret? She was free. Beatrice, however, had a different story. As the storm raged outside, she found herself once again facing the ice on her walkway. This time, however, her knees still ached from that fateful fall. She spent hours trying to clear the snow herself, but her body, still recovering, wasn't cooperating. By midday, she was exhausted, hands raw from the cold. And as she struggled with the heavy, wet snow, the memory of Margaret's ramp, a symbol of warmth, protection, and grace, came flooding back. A few days ago, she had stood on that porch, asking if Margaret was okay. Today, she was still feeling the sting of the truth she could no longer deny. That ramp had been a lifeline, and she had tried to take it from her. Finally, defeated, Beatrice made the long walk across the street. The walk was slower than usual, the cane tapping against the icy ground with each step. She felt the weight of the years of her rigid control, the missed opportunities to be kind, to be human. Her mind replayed the memories of her failed sabotage, the efforts that had now faded into something more profound, regret. When she knocked on Margaret's door, her knuckles felt cold, the tremor in her hand a reflection of the vulnerability she had tried so long to suppress. Margaret answered, her face lighting up in surprise, but there was no judgment, only understanding. Beatrice hesitated before speaking. "I could use some help with the snow." Margaret nodded without a word, then turned to beckon her inside. "Of course. Let's get you warm first." As they sat together in the living room, the wind howled outside, but inside there was quiet peace. Beatrice felt the warmth of Margaret's kindness, a fire she hadn't expected. And as Margaret handed her a cup of tea, she realized that it wasn't the ramp that had made the difference. It was the people, the kindness, and the willingness to stand together even when the world outside seemed cold. As spring arrived in full, Silverwood Hollow began to bloom, not just with crocuses and cherry blossoms, but with a sense of renewed connection. The last patches of snow receded beneath budding trees, and birdsong returned to mornings once filled with silence and frost. Lawns turned green again. Children resumed their games in the cul-de-sac. And amid it all, Margaret Holloway's ramp remained, no longer just a structure, but a monument to quiet resistance and community grace. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves began to stop by more often. Some asked about the heating system. Others offered fresh baked goods or simply said thank you. The ramp had sparked something unexpected, a collective awareness that safety and accessibility didn't disrupt the neighborhood's beauty. They added to it. Inspired by Margaret's story, other residents began modifying their own homes. One family installed a heated walkway for their elderly father. Another, whose daughter used a mobility scooter, added ramps without hesitation. And this time, the HOA didn't object. Beatrice Crowley had quietly stepped down from the compliance committee, citing personal reflection as her reason. There was no spectacle, no forced apology, just an absence where her authority had once cast a long, cold shadow. Though Beatrice kept to herself, she was no longer feared. In fact, some neighbors even nodded at her politely. Margaret, ever gracious, continued to offer her the same quiet warmth she gave everyone else. They never became close. But every now and then, when their paths crossed, there was a soft look exchanged, one part forgiveness, one part understanding. The teens who had built the ramp were celebrated at the town's spring festival. Certificates were handed out, photos taken, and their stories shared in a local newspaper under the headline, "Warming the Way, How 4 Teens and 1 Ramp Melted a Neighborhood's Coldest Rule." Margaret, proud but humble, gave a short speech. She thanked them, not just for the ramp, but for proving that kindness was still the strongest structure of all. And every winter afterward, when the first snow began to fall, Margot would flip the switch beside her door. The faint hum of the cables beneath the ramp was barely audible, but it meant everything, because it wasn't just heat rising from the boards. It was defiance. It was dignity. It was a promise that in Silverwood Hollow, no one would ever be left out in the cold again. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And remember, when given a choice between uniformity and compassion, choose to warm someone's path.